Sorry.
Brilliant. That's okay. So yeah, thanks for joining us. This is suite or presentation 2 in a series of 4 that we're providing. I'm Darren Peck from Recro Vida. For those joining the call, Recro Vida is a small consultancy with sustainability, wellbeing, and personal development as part of the service offering. And we're obviously delivering these in partnership with Devon and Plymouth Chamber, who we're a member of ourselves. And Katie, I'll let her introduce herself.
Yeah, so I work for the Devon and Plymouth Chamber as their sustainability advisor. The Chamber is really committed to climate change and that, and we have our strategic priorities for this year are people, planet, and purpose. So this is what fits exactly into the planet, and it's what we're trying to do for the Chamber and for our members.
Brilliant. Okay, so it looks like it's going to be quite an intimate session, which is good. So instead of having questions at the end, we'll just have questions as and when. I don't know if there's a hand up function in Zoom, but yeah, if you maybe put your hand up and then we'll finish a point and then you can ask questions. As I say, this is carbon policy, so what it is, why you need one, a little bit of information, tips and tricks, things like that. Obviously, it follows on from our Carbon 101 session, which was more about the basics, and that's available on the Net Zero Hub, which is on the Chamber website. And then in a month's time, although it is 1 week pushed back because of the Easter break, 28th of April, we'll do more about your carbon reduction strategy and a bit more information about that, as you can see on the screen. And then in May, we'll be doing how you actually deliver on that strategy and, yeah, pursue your path to net zero. So let's get into it.
So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a recap because it may have been quite a while since our last session, just to make sure that we're all up to date with that. So we cover climate change, what climate change is and the effects of it. Climate change is a long-term shift in weather patterns, primarily driven by human activities releasing greenhouse gases. So I know we covered all that last session, we looked at the impacts, and we're already starting to see impacts of climate change now. It's not something in the future, we're already seeing these impacts. So the international goal as set by the COP, such as COP26 in Glasgow, the UN climate change conferences, they have set a goal to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So then your carbon footprint is the amount of carbon dioxide emissions released as the result of your organization's activities. And whilst there are other greenhouse gases, carbon is by far the most dominant, so emissions are always reported as CO2 equivalents, although they should be calculated separately. And when we're looking at the carbon footprint, it falls into 3 different scopes. And we'll go into these in more detail in this session and the next session. But scope 1 are the direct emissions under your control. So that would be your fuel on site, your gas boiler, company vehicles, or aircon and refrigerant losses. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions from your electricity that is purchased and used by you. And then scope 3 is everything else. So that is your indirect emissions from sources you do not own or control, which includes water, waste, mileage, employee commuting, and your supply chain. And this is, it does make up a vast amount of emissions. It's usually about 75%. But due to the difficulty in control, lack of control, and difficulty in calculating it, there's much less requirement to report on scope 3, which would be pleased in some ways to know. Any questions on what happened last session or anything in between before we get started on carbon policy? Sorry, there's a bit of a quick roundup, but.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so we'll kick on with the main focus of today's session. So yeah, what is your carbon policy? So essentially, it might seem a little bit over sort of bearing to focus specifically on this, but this is essentially your first step in your organization's journey towards net zero or carbon policy, carbon positive. So a recap quickly. So net zero is essentially you reduce all of your emissions as much as feasibly possible, and then you offset the additional amount. Carbon positive is essentially to a point where you reduce the amount of carbon in your operations and actually sequester or remove additional carbon from the environment. So essentially, when you set that out as part of your carbon policy, you will dictate, as we go through the course of this session, what your stance is on that, what goals you're going to have, and how you're going to achieve that as a one sort of very concise document. So although generally it will be a separate document, this a carbon policy, obviously it's very very big theme at the moment in environment and in corporate social responsibility. So generally people or organizations will be setting a standalone carbon policy. However, you can have that as part of your existing company's environmental policy, but generally you'd have a main environmental policy and then a standalone carbon one. So moving on then, so what should a carbon policy be? So to make the most use out of it, we'll go through and detail what that should be. Essentially, you could have a sort of one page and one paragraph statement to say, as part of your carbon policy, to say we will operate in a way that is conducive to the a positive contribution to the environment, and we will look to tackle our carbon. There wouldn't really be much benefit from doing that, although you could technically say on any of your tender returns or any display that on your website, you would technically have a carbon policy, but it wouldn't really add any value to you, your customers, or your supply or value chain, as it's sometimes termed. Supply chain essentially and value chain are the same thing. Value chain, I think, is a bit more of an American term. Supply chain is generally what we use in the UK. So essentially your supply chain, like Katie was saying, is any of your scope 3 emissions. So those that you don't own or control. So moving on to the sort of more sort of on the carbon policy. So what should it be? It should be, sorry, go back one. It should be defined. So essentially defining whether or not you're going to try and achieve carbon net zero. So like as the definition just described. So making that distinction between carbon net zero or carbon positive. It should be time-based. So obviously the UK government is committed to net zero by 2050. Plymouth City Council as a body have committed to climate net zero by carbon net zero by 2030, and hence that's why they've been one of the cities to declare a climate emergency. Obviously, we've only got sort of 8 years to complete that now. So setting a net zero by a certain amount of time, it actually adds weight to the carbon policy because it's time based. So, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how you set that later on in the session. And then it also needs to be baseline. So it needs to be baseline against an average or full year of your company's operations. So obviously at the moment, with the way that COVID affected business operations, if you would take 2020, for example, as your baseline year, it probably wouldn't be an accurate representation of that period or your business operations, sorry. But a lot of companies are now utilizing maybe 2021 as a more stereotypical or average. It doesn't really matter what year you take, although it has to be a complete year. It doesn't have to be from financial year. It doesn't have to be from calendar year. It can be from a point in time to a point in time. However, generally with other reporting metrics in your organization, it's probably easiest to pick either calendar year or financial year. The benefit of picking maybe a more sort of a busier year for your operations will mean that then you can demonstrate, once you do have that data, that you've had a better reduction. Sometimes people might use that, say that's a bit of creative accounting, but essentially if you use a larger year as your baseline year, as long as it's within the last couple of years, that may be better in terms of getting buy-in from when you can then demonstrate a reduction year on year or within a period. So that might be something that you might want to consider if you are looking for further investment in resource or further investment in sort of support infrastructure to help not only your carbon journey, but other elements of your drive to be a more sort of socially responsible business or environmentally friendly business. So I'll move on to some of the other elements. So it should be empirical. So it should have a figure attributed to it, an aspirational figure, and your baseline will obviously affect that and how your operation is set up. So if you're working in maybe the transport industry, you have maybe less control over your supply chain than maybe another industry which is a bit smaller and a bit maybe if you utilize a service from one location, it might be a bit easier to understand your supply chain. So maybe you would aspire for a higher reduction. The reason why generally sort of 80 to 90% is normally targeted is because it's a realistic amount, because there's always going to be carbon generated from your business. And that is why generally the acceptable standard is for net zero, you will target as much of the carbon reduction that you can, generally around 90%, and then that further 10% will use an accredited scheme to offset that remaining residual carbon. And then once you get in towards the sort of higher echelons or the more stringent carbon policies, you'd use a standard assessment metric, e.g. science-based targets. I'm not sure if anyone on the call has heard about that in the industry, but science-based targets is a scientific way of measuring your carbon. And it is generally an accepted industry sort of standard. And then finally, the probably last piece in that journey towards having a sort of really high level, really efficient and prominent carbon policy would be having that assessed externally, so you can validate those claims. So you can actually take an external company in to say, this is our carbon policy, and we've had that externally verified by a accredited or professional company to say that what we claim is actually followed up on. You know, there's a lot of fake news at the moment, and a lot of fake statistics around on the internet. So having that validation externally adds a lot of weight to your promotion and your generating that sort of content for marketing or social media or things like that. So it adds a little bit of extra weight to that. So is there any other questions at the moment? Feel free to chime in if you do.
Oh, I was going to say, with the science-based targets, are they the sort of science-based sort of calculators for that you can put things into and it works out? I suppose like the carbon footprint calculator. Is that what you mean? No.
I've got a little bit more about the science-based targets later on. So
okay, all right. I'll leave. I'll wait. Thank you. That's all right.
Anything else?
No. Okay, we'll carry on then. Yeah, so a little bit more about benefits. Obviously, most businesses operate to generate profit, so that's a big part of it. Like we were talking about in the last call, enhancing your public image, so being able to promote as a sort of socially responsible business is a big part of business now. I used to work for a company called Mace, and a third of our clients based them engaging with us on our social responsible credentials, essentially. You can also have increased competitiveness, so the fact that you're tackling your carbon, maybe you can benefit from reduced energy costs, leaner operational costs. It also has a clear framework of how you're going to manage carbon or how you're going to manage your operations. And there are lots of sort of other benefits from that. So yeah, staff attraction and retention. Obviously, a lot of industries will understand, particularly in the Southwest, that there is a bit of a war on talent. Particularly in some industries, like I work in construction and sustainability, there is a big shortfall in good talent. So, and in terms of attracting new talent, a lot of millennials and other sort of social groups looking for companies which actually are addressing sort of social issues or acting responsibly. So it is a big part of now how you attract or retain talent to your operations. And then yeah, generally wastage and reduction savings will add on to the benefits that you'll generate from having that carbon policy and then going on that journey towards net zero.
So there are very different levels of policy. So as you can see here, you're looking at the basic sort of level 1, a carbon statement. As sort of Darren mentioned earlier, that could be something as simple as having a paragraph or a couple of lines in an already existing environmental policy or standalone that's simply saying something along the lines of we're looking to reduce our carbon. Obviously, as Darren explained earlier, it doesn't really tie you into much. There's no accountability there. There's not much progress in that sort of sense. So then level 2, you're looking at a carbon reduction plan. And this is something we're going to focus on a lot more in the next session. So that's about how you're actually going to achieve those targets, looking at those actions that you need to take to be achieving reductions in carbon. So then as you progress more, you're looking at setting targets, following greenhouse gas protocols. I don't know if anybody has heard of them, but they're internationally recognized as the standardized way of accounting for greenhouse gases. They provide a great deal of guidance on that, and they are linked in the last slide. We've got some links on there, and for you to look at that guidance, which is really quite useful, and that will help in your carbon policy too. So then again, below we've mentioned the Science-Based Targets Initiative, that's the SBTI, which I'll touch on the next slide. And then you're looking finally down to accredited. So that's having an external source verify your claims and verify that you are working towards those targets and that they are backed by science. So does anybody have a carbon policy currently of any of those levels? Either in the chat or... I think that's a no. I'm going to take that as. How confident do you guys feel about, from seeing what we've said? Yeah, I've got a no from David there. How confident do you think before the next session or in a couple of years, do you think you'd be able to get to the lower levels, or how do you think you feel about that? Sort of opening that up for a bit of discussion there, if anyone wants to jump in.
I'll jump in and kick things off. So we're, as a company, we've spent a couple of years sort of getting the sort of discussing where we go with some of the partners. It's an interesting one as a company because we have two parts to us. One part is what we do as a business and our own impact. And so they will, the target we're looking at is to try and get to net zero carbon neutrality as a company by 2030. But we also, as a construction consultancy with architects and engineers, most of our impact is on what we design and what we do for our clients. So actually that has the biggest impact. So again, we've signed up to the RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge, which tries to get all of the projects you're working on down to pretty much sort of net zero level or with some carbon offsetting by 2030, and that's quite a big task. So that's our first target, and I think the first bit was getting a commitment from the top to get there. That's what we've got to, that's what we've got to achieve. But now we're in that position of, okay, we've got 8 years trying to understand what do we need to do and what are the steps that we need to do to get to that point. And it's, like a lot of people, we're at the beginning of that road, and we're just not sure how many twists and turns that road has yet.
Yeah, definitely having that approval from that top, having that sign off and that commitment from management is really key. And yeah, those sort of steps and those actions to take is something we're going to focus on a lot more on next session.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it can be quite sort of yeah, daunting to be able to do that, especially I'm not sure how it's sort of being run, David, in your organization. Is there any sort of subject matter experts or sustainable design leads or anything like that that are in a part of your?
Well, yeah, I'm one of them, which is why I'm here.
Okay.
So we've got, I mean, we follow ISO 14001 anyway, so we have an EMS group that looks after that. But we sort of split things. So at the moment, I've got kind of a foot in both camps. We kind of split it into an EMS group and a sustainability group. So the sustainability group is looking more at the sort of the design side, what we need to do for that, and then the EMS looks more sort of at the business side. And I've kind of got a foot in both camps at the moment. But I mean, we held a green week during COP26 to try and get engagement with all of our staff and across all of our offices, hosting online events and just sort of getting people thinking about stuff and talking and getting those conversations going, which was great. It was one of the things we wanted to start doing once we got that buy-in from the top. We wanted to make sure we got buy-in from everyone else, so that right from the person who answers the phone on the front desk to to the person who's paying the paychecks, all to be on board with what we wanted to achieve. And now we're really sort of going through this process of understanding, right, what do we need in terms of our policies, carbon policy, net zero roadmap. There's suddenly a sort of it's dawned on us that there's an awful lot of documentation, an awful lot of procedures. It's pretty much going to affect everything we do. We're going to have to look at and rework to ensure that we're following this particular path.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, well, it's good to hear that you've got two sort of focus groups on those areas, and that you are challenging it. That's a big part of what we'll talk about in the next session. Just coming up to the call, we've got a few other people on the call. So yeah, I mean, we would be able to look at sort of templates and things like that.
Got the structure in the next couple of slides that we're going to be going through and working through what sort of structure you'd be wanting to look at. So I think that will help.
I can provide sort of consultancy advice on that as well. That's obviously one tenet of the Recro Vida business. So I'm providing a lot of these sessions to the chamber as a member sort of for free, but I can provide additional sort of targeted advice to businesses as well. So that's a big part of what I do. So if people want help with that after the call, I'm happy to do so. Lisa's saying maybe in a year. Yeah, I mean, these things like David was saying, they do take time. There's a lot of input that is required, and also when it's
make sure it's done right.
Yeah, and sometimes when it's obviously not your full-time role, appreciate that sometimes it takes additional time. That's why obviously a lot of consultancies exist to provide that targeted advice and guidance and provide some of that documentation front end to help out with.
Russell said want to have a policy published in the next 3 to 4 months. That's great.
That's great. Yeah.
Ben, sorry, I'm in a noisy room. Run at this probably in the wrong way, but have all our plans and statements aligned within our integrated management systems and committed to net zero from July this year. We're making great progress on reduction, but it's not following the structure. Well, that sounds great. You have committed to net zero, so that's sort of in that sort of level 4 band of neutrality targets that you have set that target for net zero, and that it looks as if you've got the management systems for it. You've already made some progress on setting those steps.
I mean, yeah, I think for those sort of non-specialists, non-subject matter experts, just going with it and committing to doing something is better than nothing. And then there's sometimes a learning by doing exercise. So yeah, the fact that you've gone that far is great. So yeah, okay. Well, if there's not any other questions, we'll carry on, and hopefully you'll glean some more information about how to, if you haven't yet.
Okay, so when you're looking at what to include in your policy now, you want to start by outlining what your organization is, the activities that you undertake, and sort of what your mission is, to why you are looking to set out why you're looking to reduce your carbon emissions, essentially. So that'd be sort of a short little paragraph there outlining that. then you want to make sure that you set out what your target actually is. So whether you're looking at 2030, 2050, and we'll go over targets a little bit more in the next slide. And then sort of a brief outline you want to do of the steps that you're working to achieve this. And then the carbon reduction strategy, which we're going to be focusing on next session, is a much more detailed breakdown of those steps that will be taken to reach net zero. So those will be sort of calculated about what those actions will need to be taken. So this is can be quite detailed. So this wouldn't necessarily be part of your policy that's outward facing, but it can be included in that, or it could be a separate document that could be then internal, and then you've got this policy that's an external source, if that makes sense. So in terms of setting targets, so as we mentioned before, the international goal, we are striving to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the Science Based Targets Initiative that we've touched on this a little bit earlier. So the science-based targets, if you're looking at a larger organization, which I appreciate we are SMEs here today, so larger organizations are expected to calculate a science-based target themselves, and within that, in order to verify within the Science-Based Targets Initiative, they'd be expected to calculate from their own emissions exactly what they specifically as a company need to reduce emissions by in order to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, as you might understand, that is quite a detailed task. So for SMEs and micros, the Science-Based Targets Initiative has a more streamlined approach. So you can align yourselves to one of the three pathways here. So what you'd be looking at there is after you've calculated your baseline, now depending on which year your baseline is set at, you would then choose to, by 2030, be reducing your scopes 1 and 2 emissions. So that's your fuel burned on site and your electricity. You'd be looking to reduce those by between 42 to 50% by 2030. Now, if you follow one of these pathways, you are then aligned within a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. So the reason that is a little bit more of a streamlined approach is because the time and effort involved in calculating the science-based targets, specifically for your organization, is quite a large task, and they appreciate that for SMEs that's not necessarily feasible. But obviously, if you are on the larger side of the SME official definition, then that is something you should be maybe looking towards to really sort of reach that that's personalized to you. So make sure that you are on that level.
And I think the Science-Based Targets Initiative defines SME as up to 250 employees.
Yeah, so obviously that can be very different from the micros that you could. There's quite a large range, and companies are going to look very different from organizations that have below 10 employees to up to that 250 mark. So if you are more at that 250 mark, then that is something you should maybe be looking more towards doing.
Yeah, generally, if you're on the upper threshold of that, it would probably be expected that you would go with an actual official calculation. But with that, hopefully, if you have got that amount of people in your organization, you probably do have 1 or 2 at least dedicated sort of sustainability environment professionals who can do that, and that's part of their role. So hopefully that justifies that additional work.
Does that, Lisa, answer your question a bit more about the science-based targets?
Yes, now I understand. So you would have to be looking at your energy bills from 2018, 19 or 20, is that right? To see what you were using then and then reduce that down.
Yes, so if you've so we'll touch on calculation a little bit later on, but essentially whatever you've calculated your baseline year to be, whether that's 2018, 2019 or 2020, the Science-Based Targets Initiatives themselves don't really recommend doing beyond 2018, just because of reliability of data, that sort of thing. So in their streamlined approach, they only give those set 3 years. So you would, if you were looking to align yourself with that approach, you would need to be choosing one of those 3 years. And then, so
essentially, sorry. Now I was going to say 2020 would have been the lowest because of lockdown. So 2019 might be a good year.
Yeah, I would say.
Is that right?
Yeah, you want to be looking at what you can achieve as an average year. Yes, the chamber ourselves, we have that. Our financial year for 2019 is our baseline, because that's before COVID, before lockdown, so you can get a really good understanding of what your normal operations are before, obviously, all this sort of thing.
Great.
So you want to align yourself. So if you're looking at 2019, you want to be aiming to reduce your emissions by 46% for scope 1 and 2 by 2030, and then looking to start measuring your scope 3.
Great. Okay, thank you. I'm just starting to get to grips with scopes now, so that's happened from your first course. So thank you.
Yes, no, I appreciate there's a lot involved in that. So there's a lot of technicalities to wrap your head around if you're looking at it for the first time. So
okay, brilliant, yeah.
So as we've said, next session is all going to be about the carbon reduction strategy. But what you really need to be looking at is your actions within the strategy. You want to be making sure that they're smart. And you may have come across the SMART acronym in business already. So you're looking at specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So making sure that they're not over ambitious, that you can actually achieve them, and that you can measure them. So you want to make sure that you can track and make sure that you are staying on target as well. That's the real importance. So yeah, like I said, we'll be going into this a lot more detail next session. And you also want to make sure that all of your actions, you have a specific person that they're assigned to, so that you have that accountability.
And also accountability at the sort of senior leadership level. So a lot of companies, if they've got a sort of more than one person as part of the board, they would have a dedicated carbon champion or environmental champion that is, it's in their performance KPIs that they have to deliver on carbon net zero or to an extent. It gives a lot more weight to, like David was saying about having the leadership tied in. It gives a lot more weight to actually it getting done. So it's very important.
So Russell,
Can I ask a question? Oh, sorry, can I ask a question? If you moved into a new building recently and you're looking at your old bills, that's not going to be comparable, is it? So you might have to use this year as a as your baseline and then start next year or something.
Yes,
if you've moved,
recalculating your baseline.
Okay, thank you.
So Russell's put a question in the chat. How do you measure emissions reduction when your business is growing, people and output, which actually increase emissions year on year? So after you calculate your emissions, what is quite common to do is to do them based on intensity. So you would set your emissions against either number of staff or turnover, that sort of thing. So obviously then if you've got an increased profit, you are going to be increasing carbon emissions. If you're in manufacturing, obviously the more you produce, the more emissions you are going to be having. So intensity is definitely something that is the sound to measure, but you would be looking, when you're reporting, to be reporting both absolute emissions and emissions intensity. Generally,
like what you would use as a metric to then display how you're tracking against those sorts of KPIs would be either your activity of carbons, kilograms of carbon, CO2 equivalent over 100k project spend, or again kilograms of CO2 equivalent over FTE, so full-time equivalent of staff. And that would be a good measurement of how you would then display that and how you're tracking against that month to month or year to year. Generally, that's sort of ones that we generally use in construction. Yeah. So any other questions, or should we carry on? I think we're doing all right for time, aren't we? Yeah. Okay, carry on then. Yeah.
So yeah, these are some sort of example actions you can see here that would go into a production plan. So you're looking at monthly meter readings, calculating carbon footprint, and you can see that you've got the action, the member of staff responsible, your target completion date, and then any notes extra. So that's sort of how you would set that out. But yeah, like I said, we'll go into more detail about how you work out what actions to take next session. Obviously, that's quite a daunting step. So it's obviously, we're looking at setting your targets here, and then next session is actually how you achieve those targets.
So moving on, what maybe you shouldn't be doing is, be transparent with your evidence. Everyone is on their journey. Everyone understands how complicated it may well be to do this. So similar to what David was mentioning about the sort of approach in environmental management systems, if people are familiar with that, as long as you understand that there may be issues in your organization, but then you put in a mitigation or action plans relate to that, that's not an issue. It's actually being transparent and open, saying we do have, a quite old-fashioned boiler in our, on our own, one of our own assets, is something that it's midway through its life period. We may need to swap that out, but that is on our plan to do so. Obviously, there's a trade-off in any sustainability. There's always a positive and negative to every action. So swapping out a midlife boiler wouldn't be overall massively conducive to overall sustainability. It might actually generate you better in terms of your energy efficiency in that short term. But in terms of swapping out a completely the embodied carbon, so the carbon which is as part of that product or piece of equipment, would then obviously offset the amount of savings that you've probably generated from that energy usage. So just be transparent and don't omit any negatives from any of your reporting. It all builds the bigger picture. Avoid any sort of not poorly worded text. Quite often, that if you don't get these sorts of things checked by subject matter experts, terms are confused with regards to carbon strategy, carbon reduction plan. Even in technical roles, it happens. Net zero or net like carbon positive or things like that. So make sure you do get that checked and make sure that it is clear in your wording. Generally, I would only expect for a carbon policy it to be 1 page of A4 with two or three paragraphs, and also this is on the next slide. I've jumped the gun, sorry. So like Katie was saying, I'll just finish off this slide. The set specific actionable SMART targets and engage a specialist. So what I was saying, keep it on 1 page of A4. Say I would suggest you have a separate environmental policy, because generally I would say you'd have a health and safety policy, environment policy, quality policy, and then as the additional support ones, you would have your carbon or your biodiversity policy from a sustainability perspective. So just have 1 page of A4. Ensure it's signed and dated by the management. So whoever that carbon champion is on your sort of board of directors, with those firm commitments, it gives a personability to that target, and it also gives ownership to one person. Review and update it regularly. Obviously, as your new baselines come in, as you understand your operation better, if you are tracking, like when you get towards tracking and delivering upon, review that and update that so they're in line with how you are doing. Like Kate was saying, be realistic. Don't try and overachieve. It does take time for a lot of these things, especially like I'm saying, if you've got, for example, at Babcock, we've got a purchase agreement on the fleet operated buses, so we can't switch them out without actually early termination of our agreement with the bus provider. So although they're diesel operated, diesel fueled vehicles, we can't do that. So that's something that we just have to manage. Similarly, with regards to sort of purchase agreements for energy, for example, sometimes you might be tied into a certain period, so it's not as easy as just switching straight away. If you're on a non-renewable tariff, you might be able to change to a renewable tariff, and again we'll go into more detail on that. But so there are some quick wins, there are some medium-term wins, and there are some longer-term wins that you can have. And then also consider how to communicate that. Obviously, you're going to benefit from that communication on social media and things like that, but make sure again that it is checked and it is communicated to the right audience in the right way.
Sorry, just jumping in about Lisa's comment. Offsetting is a bit tricky. It's definitely about how you're communicating that. If you're sort of just saying we're offsetting, that's amazing, that's not really doing much, offsetting is a great tool, but it should be just part of the tools. You should be only offsetting whilst you're actively reducing carbon emissions. You're actually working to do that. And it's only really sort of the residual emissions you can't do, you'd be looking to offset. It's also making sure that the schemes that you have, there are certifications for offsetting schemes. So making sure that your schemes are certified, they're not just, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Yeah. So
It's
that's
a very new industry. So it's,
yeah, that's the whole idea of net zero. So try and reduce as much as you can, and then there is an understanding that you will have to offset. And then, like Kate was saying, choose a recognised and accredited offset scheme, and also have to realise that sometimes you'll be actually be buying future offsets. So if you sponsor a new woodland, until those trees get to a certain level of maturity, they don't actually have a benefit of the environment. So you might be buying a credit now for offsetting, which might take 15 years to mature, which essentially is how that tree will then become mature enough to be able to take enough carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to be actually be an offset. So yeah, there's a lot of science. It's a very new element, but there are a lot more regulation coming into it in the last couple of years, when that sort of drive for sort of climate emergency and the new sort of standards has come in. There's been a lot more regulation going into it, which is a good thing. So
yeah, it's just making sure that offsetting is not the only thing you're doing, really. And make sure that you're communicating that.
okay, so yeah, a bit more about the communication. So internal communication, this is so make this available to your staff. Make sure that it's not just a blanket email which goes out and we've done this. Try and engage them, maybe even have an event, internal event, about how you're, you know, driving on that. I say it is important to a lot of staff. People do find it quite emotive, and especially people maybe with children, they'll be asking more and more questions about this sort of thing. So it's a good thing to share and actually engage your staff with. Yeah, so I say bring your staff in, maybe have an all arms call, or now that we're getting more into working in the office, maybe have it as part of team days or things like that, and then send that out digitally, and then make that available to everyone. Make sure it's in your sort of key documents, maybe in your supply chain documents, put it on your document management system, put it in your site offices, display it physically in your site offices, and make that available on your internal intranet. So it's just, as when it's new, it's something to be celebrated. Obviously a lot of work goes into it and it's a big commitment, so make that readily available to a lot of your staff. And then in terms of externally communicating it, making sure once that's all been checked, share it on social media, we had a company website. A lot of companies now actually have a sustainability in the top ribbon now, whereas before you might be 3 and 4 and 5 clicks away to find that. It's now such a big part of modern responsible businesses. Making sure that, again, making sure the collateral or the market materials are clear, high quality, and they are fit for purpose. So making sure you don't overburden information where it maybe isn't suited. And then maybe even hold a supply chain or value chain event where you celebrate that with your customers, your clients, your key stakeholders, even have your board on there. And yeah, it is something to be celebrated, because it does take a lot of work. It is a big commitment, and it does need to tie up a lot of different individuals or organizations in your supply chain. So make them aware of that. And by doing so, it might prompt people who are maybe less developed in their carbon net zero or carbon positive journeys to then stimulate action for them, which will essentially act as a force multiplier for your organization to drive down carbon if they drive down carbon in their supply chain or their organization. It helps you in terms of your supply chain. So it's a big part of what you can do.
So do we have any questions on policy before we move on to scoping and calculating emissions?
And yeah, okay. We will be talking about this more as obviously the next 2 sessions go on. So this is just an overview.
Time at the end for questions as well. So Yeah. Okay. So we're looking now at scope, your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So we've been through this already, but scope 1, that's your emissions under your control. So gas boilers, company-owned vehicles, and refrigerant losses from air conditioning refrigerants. So that's what we're looking at for scope 1. Then scope 2 is your indirect emissions from purchased electricity that you're consuming. So the first step in calculating these is identifying your usage. So looking at your scope 1 and 2, depending on your organization, you need to be looking at your electricity bills, your gas bills, your vehicle fuel cards, or any sort of fuel mileage. So ideally, you'd be looking at getting the actual fuel used. If you don't have access to that, then you can substitute that in using the cost or mileage, but it is much better to use the actual usage rate. So if you see here, this is an electricity bill. So for both electricity and gas, you want to be looking for kilowatt hours. So you can see that little X there. You want to be looking for the amount of kilowatt hours you're using in either electricity or gas, and then that's what you'll be using to calculate.
So most standard meters will have that on there. It's just a matter of cycling through to the right element and making sure. I work in construction, quite often we ask sort of site people to take the meter readings, but we'll get the wrong photograph of that. Without kilowatt hours, it can't effectively calculate that. So it's just a matter of upskilling people to understand that. And that's obviously why I've brought up. That's essentially a example meter electricity bill, so you can look at that and understand what it might look like. And there is a lot of confusing numbers and things like that on there, but essentially, yeah, it's honing in on what you exactly need.
Yes, that's on the second page of the bill, and you can use bills, but if you're looking at bills, you want to make sure that they are monthly bills. That's much better. You want to be identifying your usage on a monthly basis, ideally. Climate change levy. So the climate change levy is on the bill at the bottom there. Yeah, so this is actually taken off one of the Chamber's own bills for one of the recent months. So yeah, the climate change levy is correct.
Okay, we'll move on, just in conscious of time.
Yeah. So when you're looking at your scope 1 and 2 emissions, there are 2 methods of calculation. So after you've got your usage on a monthly basis, you want to be then looking at the yearly basis for calculating your carbon. So you can either use this. The market-based method is based on a supplier specific rate. So if you are on a renewable energy tariff, you can make use of that. Whereas if you're on the location-based method, that's an average of the UK's average emissions, which I'll detail how to find both of those later. So you can calculate this yourself. You can spreadsheet this if you're feeling confident with Excel and do the calculations. The actual calculations aren't that complicated. The most complicated part is finding the bills, making sure you're covering everything within that scope. That's where the technicalities come in, but the actual calculations, they are relatively simple. So there are calculators available, such as the Carbon Trust has a calculator, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but it is quite easy to calculate yourself. So for the market-based approach, see, this is another one of the Chamber's bills. So you can see here, this will be on the second page of your bill, where it says the fuel mix. So you can see both there, that is the CO2 emissions in red, this side thing, because we are on a renewable tariff. We don't have any CO2 emissions associated with that. So for our scope 2 emissions, because it's electricity, there's essentially nothing, but it's good practice to report your emissions both from if you're doing the market-based approach and reporting this as 0, it's also good to be reporting your emissions in line with the UK average emissions, just so that then you can be tracking reducing your actual usage, as well as just saying there's no carbon here. If that,
So the renewable tariff, just to clarify, is where you get 100% of your energy from renewable sources. You can secure that early, and that's what a lot of companies are being encouraged to do, essentially because at the moment, I believe around 50% of the UK's energy is generated from renewable sources.
Yeah, you can see the UK average energy sources on the second column there. So you've got 38% renewable and 70% nuclear.
So that renewable component obviously is fairly limited at the moment, and the earlier you adopt that renewable element and say to your sort of energy provider, I want all of my energy using like companies like Ecotricity, or there are a few others that you can use to get a full amount of renewable energy in from your supply, the better, because as everyone scrambles to the net zero journey, there's only going to be a certain amount allocated still. So that's quite an early one that you can have quite a significant change by switching to a renewable talent. I think it's about 80 to 90% reduction, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's obviously dependent on your rest of your scopes. For the chamber, we don't have any company vehicles, so our scope 1 and 2 emissions entirely come down to the gas in our boiler and our electricity. So obviously having a renewable tariff does make a significant difference to our emissions that we are reporting. The one thing to note though is, as you can see here, the tariff is actually only 76% renewable. And it is good practice to be reporting that you are using nuclear energy too, because obviously there is some debate about nuclear and renewable, but it is just good practice to report that. So the location-based approach. So every year the government, on the government website, publishes conversion factors for greenhouse gas reporting. And these conversion factors are all in an Excel file you can download off the government website, and they cover pretty much everything. You've got your natural gas, biogas, biodiesel, water, waste. So all the conversion factors are in there for your location-based approach. So what you would simply do is you would times your kilowatt hours by the conversion factor for your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So the link to that is on the last slide, which we'll be emailing out to you. Anybody have any questions on that?
I think we'll skip through and pass the time
Okay.
to then.
So in terms of reporting, in terms of transparency, when you're looking at reporting your emissions, you want to make sure that you are stating the reporting period. This is for what scopes you're including, any exclusions and why you'd be excluding that, the calculation method and approach you're using, the tools you use, whether you're using an online calculator or yourself, or the emission factors that you've used. You should also state the person responsible, either that's within your organisation or if you've used external assurance. And if there are any significant emission changes, for example, if your 2019 is your base year and 2020 you were entirely working from home, that's going to be quite a significant emission change. So then you should be stating why that is, just then you've got that detail and that full transparency available.
Okay, that's the end of the session. So say we'll be focusing on carbon reduction strategy and sort of looking into some snapshot of scope 3 calculating, obviously because of the the 15 different criteria of indirect and direct emissions upstream, downstream is quite complicated. So we'll pick and choose a few there to exemplar, but we'll look at tackling the data, how to set your strategy, and say that is 1 week later than normal. So it's on the 28th of April. So yeah, that's obviously will be available again free on Eventbrite or through the Chamber Net Zero Hub. So we'd encourage you to go away and have a look at that. Start another slide on this.
Next steps.
Start looking at the next steps. So gather your working groups, delegate tasks, assess where you are, have a decision on what level of policy realistically you could achieve at this point. Maybe it's best to maybe look at sort of the 3s and 4s on that step rather than going for 8 from the start. And then, yeah, try and calculate your scope 1 and 2 emissions like Katie was going through earlier. Engage a subject matter expert, such as myself, at some point, and then set a timeline or strategy for publishing your policy. So that's some of the next steps you might start thinking about now or undertaking.
So yeah, try and calculate your emissions. If you have any difficulties with that, contact us in the meantime, and we'll go over it a little bit more next session as well. Q&A, we are sort of right on the time, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump on quickly.
We will issue some more links to say, and this
we've got
pack.
Links here, and I'll send over the slides to you afterwards, so you've got all that information for you, and you'll be able to refer back to the slides and the recording, which will be uploaded.
Looks like everyone might be signing off. Maybe we'll stop the recording now,
Yeah.
and then if there's any further questions, we can still take them.